All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going deep on something pretty heavy, huh? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and how it basically kickstarted World War I.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Big one. So you sent me a whole stack of stuff, news articles, historical analyses from like History.com, even something from the Constitution Center.
Interesting mix.
Totally. And what I really want to get into today is, we'll cover the event itself, but like, why? Why did this assassination cause such a massive global shift?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about recounting what happened, right? It's about figuring out the context, why Europe was such a tinderbox in the early 1900s.
Right, like what made this the spark that blew everything up?
Exactly. And honestly, what can we, like over 100 years later, actually learn from this whole thing?
So much to unpack. All right, well, let's set the scene first, right? June 28th, 1914, Sarajevo, Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne.
Yeah, big deal.
Huge. He's there with his wife, Sophie, for this, like, military inspection. Can you picture it? Open-top car, sunshine, a city bustling. But underneath it all, there's this tension.
Oh, yeah. You can't forget the historical backdrop. Just a few years before, in 1908, Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Right. That was a whole thing.
It was, and it really ticked off Serbian nationalists who believed those territories should be part of Serbia. That's where the resentment starts brewing, right? And that's where Gavrilo Princip enters the picture.
Okay, so we've got the heir to a huge empire, simmering tensions, and this Gavrilo Princip guy. Who, remind me, was he?
Oh, just some young Bosnian Serb, but with a huge chip on his shoulder about the whole injustice thing. And a deadly plan, obviously.
And this is where it gets crazy, right? Like, how could this one event, this assassination, trigger a world war? It's almost unbelievable.
It's wild. So first, there's this attempt to bomb the Archduke's motorcade. It fails. But then, a wrong turn...
Oh, no.
Yeah, leads them straight into Princip's path. And, well, the rest is history, as they say.
Shots fired at point-blank range. I mean, just the audacity of it all.
Shocking. But to really get why it was so significant, you got to understand just how messed up the political scene was in Europe at that point. It was literally like a powder keg ready to explode.
Yeah, one article called it a powder keg, another a tinderbox.
Mm-hmm.
Same idea, right?
Yeah.
Like everything's just primed to go off.
Precisely. And it all comes down to this insane web of alliances. It's like, imagine each country's tied to another by a string, and if one tugs, everyone gets pulled in.
Oh, that's a great visual.
Right. So you've got Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy in one corner, then Russia, France, and Great Britain in the other. And these alliances meant if one went to war, the others had to jump in too.
So like if, I don't know, country A picks a fight with country B, but country C is buddy-buddy with B, they're dragged in whether they like it or not.
Exactly. Recipe for disaster, basically.
Yeah.
And on top of that, remember, tensions had been brewing for ages already.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for one, nationalism was on the rise. People were super proud of their own country.
Which isn't inherently bad, right? Like patriotism, wanting to defend your homeland.
True. But it can also go too far, you know? Like when your pride blinds you to other viewpoints or makes compromise impossible.
Ah, I see. So a good thing in moderation, basically.
Definitely. Plus, on top of all that nationalistic fervor, you also had like the growing pains of industrialization. Everyone's competing for resources, markets. Breeds distrust and rivalry.
So basically, this assassination wasn't the cause of the war, but like the final straw, right? It was going to happen eventually.
You hit the nail on the head. It was a spark, but the fuel had been building up for years. It's kind of fascinating how one event can just expose the flaws in an entire system.
It's like that Jenga tower where everyone keeps pulling blocks and it gets more and more wobbly until finally
Someone pulls the wrong one.
Crash. All right, so we've got our powder keg. The spark is lit.
Yeah.
What happens next? Like play by play after the assassination.
Well, Austria-Hungary, they wasted no time blaming Serbia. They flapped them with this harsh ultimatum, basically saying, bow down to us. Super provocative.
So less about justice for the Archduke, more about flexing their muscles.
Pretty much. And Germany, because of that whole alliance thing, they immediately back Austria-Hungary up.
Oh boy, here we go.
Meanwhile, Russia, to protect Serbia, starts getting their troops ready. Things are spiraling out of control. It's like watching a domino effect. You know it's going to be bad, but you can't stop it. Declarations of war are going back and forth like crazy.
Grim telegrams just flying across Europe.
It's wild to think how a little conflict in Sarajevo could engulf a whole continent so fast.
And this is what gets me. It really shows how interconnected global politics were, even back then. This wasn't just some local tragedy. It changed the course of history. Led to one of the most devastating wars ever.
Absolutely. And the scale of that devastation. We're talking years of brutal trench warfare, millions dead, new technologies designed just to kill more efficiently. It's really heavy stuff.
Yeah, and that's just the immediate impact. We haven't even touched on the ripple effects that shaped the whole 20th century, let alone beyond.
Right. Collapsed empires, redrawn borders, the groundwork for World War II, not to mention the social and cultural shifts, gender roles, technological advancements. It's a lot to process.
It really makes you wonder, though, right? Could it have been prevented? Like, were there points where things could have gone differently?
That's the question, isn't it? Historians have debated that for ages. There are no easy answers. But we can look back and spot those key factors, those maybe turning points.
Like what? I'm curious.
Well, for one, think about that whole alliance system. It was meant to stop wars, but it made Europe so inflexible. One country moves, everyone else is obligated.
So instead of preventing war, it practically guaranteed escalation.
Yeah, you could say that. Maybe with more flexible diplomacy, a willingness to, compromise, things could have calmed down. And then there's the nationalism thing.
Right, that double-edged sword. It can unite people, but also blind them.
Exactly. It's not just about national pride either. It's about resources, power. The Industrial Revolution created this hunger for raw materials, new markets, just ramped up the tension between countries.
So you've got intense nationalism, economic rivalry, and this rigid alliance system. Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Like a perfect storm. And we can't forget the arms race that was happening. Everyone's stockpiling weapons, building bigger and badder warships, thinking that'll keep them safe.
But isn't that counterproductive? Like, if everyone's building up their armies, isn't that just making war more likely?
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. Creates this atmosphere of fear, suspicion. Any little thing feels like a threat, so you got to show force.
Well, they're practically preparing for war, even if they don't actually want it.
Yeah, it's kind of messed up when you think about it. So are we saying World War I was inevitable? Or were there chances to change course? Tough one.
It's like, I don't know, imagine a bunch of people on a really steep, icy hill, and they're all tied together with rope. One person slips.
And everyone goes tumbling down.
Exactly. So were there any almost didn't slip moments? Any missed opportunities to grab onto something, change direction?
Maybe. Some historians say the underlying tensions were just too deep. War was bound to happen. Others point to specific diplomatic fails, missed chances to talk things out, de-escalate.
Imagine if they had a group chat, right? Instead of sending telegrams, they could just text each other, yo, chill out.
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. But communication, that's a big one. Miscommunication, even worse.
It's like in those rom-coms, where everything could be solved if they just talked to each other.
Exactly. But on a global scale with, empires and armies at stake, and we can't forget the role of individual leaders, their personalities, sometimes their egos.
Oh yeah, they can mess things up big time.
For sure. Like Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, he was known for being pretty militaristic, impulsive. That definitely played a part in things escalating.
So it's a mix of everything, right? Long-term trends, short-term triggers, personalities. Man, history is complicated.
It is, but that's what makes it so interesting to study, right? Trying to piece it all together.
Definitely. Okay, but what about us? We're living over a century later. What are we supposed to take away from all this?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is just how interconnected everything is globally. Even back then, what seemed like a local issue, it blew up.
And imagine now, right? With the internet, instant communication.
Yeah.
What happens in one place can affect the whole world in minutes.
Exactly. We have to be so mindful of the consequences of our actions, even seemingly small ones. One country's choices can have huge ripple effects everywhere else.
It's like we're all part of this massive global web, whether we realize it or not.
We are, and maybe the most crucial lesson is that we need diplomacy. Dialogue, understanding other perspectives.
It sounds cheesy, but like world peace, basically.
Yeah, kind of. But seriously, we have to see beyond our own little bubbles, recognize that we're all human, all connected.
It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture, the wars and the politics. But it's important to remember the human cost too, right? Millions of lives lost, families shattered.
You're absolutely right. The statistics are overwhelming. But behind each number is a person, a story. The trauma of war, that can echo for generations, affect families, whole societies.
It's a good reminder that war is never a simple solution. It always comes at a huge price. And usually, the ones who pay the most are the ones who had the least say in starting it.
Exactly. That's why it's so vital to understand history, to connect with those human stories, to empathize with what people went through, and hopefully learn from it.
You know, it's interesting, though. Even with all the devastation and tragedy, World War I also led to some incredible innovations, societal changes. It's kind of a paradox.
Oh, absolutely. It's like necessity breeds invention. When you're faced with such huge problems, you have to think outside the box.
Like with medicine. Treating all those battlefield injuries led to breakthroughs in surgery, prosthetics, blood transfusions, saved countless lives.
Yeah, and beyond medicine, too. Aviation, communication tech, transportation, all those things were pushed forward because of the war. Think about airplanes, radios, even cars.
It's amazing what humans can achieve, even in the darkest times.
It's that resilience, that drive to adapt and innovate. But we can't just celebrate the progress without acknowledging the sacrifices that made it possible.
Right. For every cool invention, there were countless lives lost, dreams shattered. It's a complicated legacy.
Very much so. I think that's maybe the biggest lesson of all, to approach history with nuance, empathy, recognize that it's messy, it's full of both good and bad.
It's like holding two opposite ideas in your head at the same time, acknowledging the horrors of war, but also the resilience and creativity that came out of it.
Exactly. It's not about simplifying things. It's about embracing the complexity.
All right, before we move on, I want to circle back to Woodrow Wilson for a sec. His 14 points, the whole League of Nations thing.
Yeah.
Ambitious, right? Even if it didn't quite work out.
Oh, yeah, totally. Wilson's vision was maybe a little naive in some ways, but it was a genuine attempt to break that cycle of war, create a new system of global cooperation.
It's like, amidst all the wreckage, someone's trying to build something better. Imagine a world where diplomacy wins over fighting.
Right. And even though the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II, it did lay the groundwork for future organizations like the UN.
So those dreams, those ideas, they weren't wasted.
Not at all. They're worth revisiting, reimagining, especially as we face the challenges of the 21st century.
Okay, so big question. What are you taking away from all this deep dive into Franz Ferdinand, World War I? What stands out to you?
That's a good one. I think for me, it's those stories of resilience, of hope. Even in such a dark time, people were striving for peace, for connection. And that's something we can't lose sight of today.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the battles, and the politics. But those personal stories, those are the ones that really stick with you.
Absolutely. And it's not just about dwelling on the past either. It's about understanding how those forces back then shaped our world today and using that knowledge to, try and build something better.
We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. Maybe by digging into those what-if moments, those lesser-known stories of peace and cooperation, we can find some inspiration for our own time.
I love that. It's like searching for those glimmers of hope in the darkness. And those are the stories that often get overlooked in the traditional narratives of war.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the conflict, the big events. But there were people working for peace, holding on to hope, even when things seemed impossible.
And that's a legacy worth carrying forward, don't you think?
Absolutely. Okay, but one last thing before we wrap up. It's a bit of a mind bender, so bear with me. We've talked about Franz Ferdinand's assassination as the spark that started World War I, right? But what if we flipped the script? What if, instead of focusing on the violence, we looked at the potential for peace that existed before the war?
Interesting. What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Europe, even with all its tensions and rivalries, was also this hub of cultural exchange, art, new ideas. There were tons of people and groups working towards international understanding, promoting diplomacy, trying to find peaceful solutions to conflict. It's just that side of the story often gets overshadowed by the war itself.
You're right, it does. It's easy to get caught up in the narrative of conflict and miss those quieter, more subtle efforts for peace, but they were there. What if, instead of asking how World War I could have been prevented, we asked how peace could have been nurtured and strengthened? What were the seeds of hope and cooperation that existed back then? And how can we cultivate those same seeds today in our own time to create a more just and peaceful future?
That's a powerful question, and a timely one, I think.
I agree. It challenges us to look beyond the usual stories of war and consider the possibilities for peace that might have been, and maybe, just maybe, still are.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of World War I. It's an event that continues to shape our world in so many ways. We hope this has given you some new insights, some things to think about, and maybe even a little bit of hope. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a story we're all writing together every single day.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another journey through the twists and turns of history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.
See you next time.
Yes.
And the war itself, World War I, it was brutal, just horrific. 4 years of trench warfare, millions dead, new technologies like poison gas, tanks, just unimaginable suffering.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of it all. But it wasn't just the immediate impact, right?
Yeah.
The ripples of this war, they shaped the whole 20th century. Even beyond that.
Oh, absolutely. Empires collapsed, borders were redrawn, and the seeds for World War II were sown right there. Plus, you can't forget the social and cultural changes. The way gender roles shifted, women taking on jobs traditionally held by men, and of course, the rapid technological advancements, some with devastating consequences.
It's crazy how one event could have such a massive impact. Looking back, though, it's hard not to ask, could it have been prevented? Were there any points where things could have gone a different way?
That's a question historians have been wrestling with for over a century. No easy answers, of course. But we can look back and identify some crucial factors, some potential turning points.
Give me an example. What kind of turning points?
Well, take the alliance system itself. It was meant to deter conflict, but it ended up making Europe incredibly rigid. One nation makes a move, and everyone else is obligated. It created that domino effect we talked about.
So instead of preventing war, the alliances practically guaranteed that any conflict would escalate.
You could say that. More flexible diplomacy, a willingness to compromise. Those things might have helped diffuse the situation. Then there's the issue of nationalism, that double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It inspired people to fight for their nation, but it also made them less willing to compromise or understand other perspectives.
And Frank, the very thing that unites people can also blind them to the humanity of others.
Exactly. And it wasn't just national pride either. It was competition for resources, for global power. The Industrial Revolution had created this insatiable hunger for raw materials and new markets, which just fueled those imperial ambitions.
So you've got this potent mix of fierce nationalism and economic rivalry all happening within this rigid alliance system. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was a perfect storm. And then you add in the arms race that was happening at the time. Each nation was stockpiling weapons, building bigger battleships, convinced that military strength was the ultimate guarantee of security.
But wouldn't that logic, if everyone is building up their weapons, actually make war more likely? It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Exactly. It creates a climate of fear and distrust. Any perceived threat is met with a show of force. In a way, they were almost preparing for war, even if they didn't consciously want it.
So, are we saying World War I was inevitable? Or were there missed opportunities to change course?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some historians argue that the underlying tensions were just too deep. War was practically unavoidable. Others point to specific diplomatic failures, missed chances for communication and de-escalation.
It's fascinating to think about those what-if moments. The moments where a different decision, a different conversation might have steered things in a completely different direction.
It is. And we can't underestimate the role of individual leaders, their personalities, their ambitions, their miscalculations. For example, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. With his militaristic posturing and impulsive decision-making, he definitely played a role in the escalation of events.
So it's this complex mix of long-term historical trends, short-term triggers, and individual personalities. Man, history is complicated.
It is. But that's what makes it so fascinating to study, right? Trying to piece it all together and ultimately trying to learn from it.
Absolutely. So here we are living in the 21st century. What are we supposed to take away from all of this? What's the relevance for us today?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we live in a deeply interconnected world. What might seem like a regional conflict can quickly escalate, especially in our world with globalized economies and instant communication. We need to be mindful of the unintended consequences of our actions.
That's a good point. Our choices, even seemingly small ones, can ripple outward and affect people all over the world.
Exactly. And perhaps the most important lesson from all of this is the absolute necessity of diplomacy, dialogue, and understanding. We need to be able to see beyond our own national interests and recognize that shared humanity that connects us all.
It sounds a little cheesy, but you're right. If we want to avoid the mistakes of the past, we need to find ways to communicate, to empathize, to build bridges instead of walls.
I couldn't agree more. It's not always easy, especially when there are deep disagreements and conflicting interests, but it's absolutely essential if we want to create a more peaceful and just world.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the grand narrative of war and forget about the human cost. Millions of lives lost, families torn apart, entire generations scarred by the horrors of the trenches. We need to remember those individual stories.
Absolutely. It's important to remember the faces behind the statistics, the human beings who experienced those unimaginable horrors. The trauma of war, both physical and emotional, can linger for generations. It affects families, communities, entire societies.
It's a sobering reminder that war is never a simple solution. It always comes at a tremendous cost. And usually the people who pay the highest price are the ones who had the least say in starting it.
Exactly. And that's why understanding history is so vital. It allows us to connect with those human stories, to empathize with the experiences of those who lived through these tumultuous times, and to carry their lessons forward. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
You know, it's interesting. Despite all the devastation and tragedy, World War I also sparked incredible innovation and societal change. It's almost like a paradox. Out of darkness came some glimmers of light.
That's a great observation. It's often said that necessity is the mother of invention, and wartime certainly forces people to think creatively, to come up with solutions to problems they never anticipated.
For instance, the advancements in medicine. The need to treat those battlefield injuries led to breakthroughs in surgery, prosthetics, blood transfusions, things that ended up saving countless lives both during and after the war.
Absolutely. And the innovations weren't limited to the medical field. The war also spurred advancements in aviation, communication technologies, transportation. Think about the development of the airplane, the radio, the automobile. These were all technologies that were profoundly shaped by the demands of war.
It's remarkable, isn't it, how human ingenuity can thrive even in the darkest of times. It's like this delicate dance between destruction and creation.
It really is. It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, our capacity to adapt and innovate, even when faced with incredible challenges. But it's also a reminder that even in the face of progress, the human cost of war should never be forgotten.
We can't just celebrate the innovations without acknowledging the sacrifices that made them possible.
Exactly. The legacy of World War I is incredibly complex. It's a tapestry woven from both triumph and tragedy.
We need to remember that for every technological advancement, there were countless lives lost, families shattered, dreams extinguished. It's a delicate balance.
It is, and perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, to approach history with nuance, with empathy, to recognize the complexities of human experience, the interplay of light and shadow, and the enduring impact of even the most distant events.
It's like holding two seemingly opposing ideas in your mind at the same time, acknowledging the horrors of war while also recognizing the resilience and ingenuity that can emerge from those difficult times.
You put it perfectly. It's not about simplifying things. It's about embracing the complexity.
All right, before we move on, I want to circle back to Woodrow Wilson and his vision for a more peaceful world order, his 14 points, the League of Nations. They were groundbreaking ideas for their time, even if they ultimately didn't achieve what he'd hoped for.
Absolutely. Wilson's vision, though perhaps a bit naive in some respects, represented a genuine attempt to break free from the cycle of war and create a new system of international cooperation. The League of Nations, while it failed to prevent World War II, laid the groundwork for future international organizations like the United Nations.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of that post-war wreckage, there were people who dared to dream of a better future, to imagine a world where diplomacy and cooperation would replace the horrors of the battlefield.
Those dreams, those aspirations, they're incredibly important. They remind us that even in the face of immense challenges, it's crucial to hold on to hope, to envision a better future and work towards it.
Exactly. It's about learning from the mistakes of the past and carrying those lessons forward as we navigate the complexities of the present and strive to build a more peaceful and just future.
Well said. The past can be a guide, a source of wisdom, but it doesn't dictate our future. We have the power to make different choices, to learn from those who came before us, and forge a new path forward.
I like that. Okay, so before we wrap up completely, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder. We've talked about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as the spark that ignited World War I, right? But what if we shifted our focus? What if, instead of dwelling on the violence and the outbreak of war, we consider the potential for peace that existed in those pre-war years?
That's a really interesting thought. I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in the narrative of the war itself, the battles, the strategies, all that. But you're right, there was this whole other side to Europe back then.
Exactly. There were tensions and rivalries, but Europe was also this incredible melting pot of cultures, art, ideas. People were traveling, exchanging knowledge. It wasn't all doom and gloom.
It's like we tend to view history through this very narrow lens, focused on the conflicts. But if you zoom out a bit, you see this whole network of people and organizations actively working towards peace, promoting diplomacy, trying to resolve conflicts peacefully. Those stories often get drowned out by the louder, more dramatic narrative of war.
It's like those unsung heroes,
Mm-hmm.
quietly working behind the scenes, trying to build bridges while everyone else is building walls. And their stories, they deserve to be told too.
Absolutely. They remind us that even in the face of rising tensions and seemingly insurmountable challenges, there's always hope. There are always people who believe in a better future and are willing to work for it. What if we shifted our perspective a bit? What if, instead of asking how World War I could have been prevented, we ask how peace could have been fostered and sustained?
I love that. It's like flipping the script, looking at the same events through a different lens. What were the seeds of hope and cooperation that existed in those pre-war years? And how can we learn from those efforts, even if they ultimately didn't prevent the war? How can we apply those lessons today to build a more peaceful world?
That's the question, isn't it? It's a challenge to look beyond the traditional narratives of conflict and explore those alternative paths, those glimmers of possibility. It requires us to acknowledge that history is not predetermined. It's a tapestry woven from countless individual choices and actions. And we in the present have the power to choose a different path, to nurture those seeds of peace and cooperation that existed back then and create a more just and equitable world.
That's a powerful thought. It's a reminder that we're not just passive observers of history, we're active participants. And the choices we make today, the actions we take, they all contribute to shaping the world of tomorrow. So yeah, let's learn from the past. Let's acknowledge the mistakes, the missed opportunities. But let's also celebrate those who dared to dream of a better world, who worked tirelessly for peace, even when the odds were stacked against them. Because their stories, they offer us hope and inspiration as we navigate the challenges of our own time.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about finding that balance, right? Remembering the horrors of war, learning from the mistakes, but also recognizing the resilience of the human spirit, that enduring hope for a brighter future, and ultimately taking responsibility for our own role in shaping that future.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of World War I. We covered a lot of ground today, from the simmering tensions of pre-war Europe to the devastating consequences of the conflict itself and the ripple effects that continue to shape our world today.
It's a complex and multifaceted event, one that deserves careful consideration and reflection. And even though it's a century old, it still holds valuable lessons for us today.
Exactly. We hope this deep dive has given you some new insights, some food for thought, and maybe, just maybe, it sparked a little bit of hope too. Because despite the darkness and the tragedy, there's always a flicker of light, a possibility for a better future. And it's up to each and every one of us to keep that flicker alive, to learn from the past, to engage with the present, and to actively shape the world we want to see.
Beautifully said. Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and thought-provoking journey.
It was my pleasure as always. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the twists and turns of history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.
See you next time.